welcome to MINDSHOCK. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. We are examining Tartaria, resets, mud flood, altered history, manufactured history, the grand conspiracy in covering up what this world is, what it was, and what happened in the transition and or reset, and who are the people that laid claim, that founded these nations, the foundations of this previous civilization architecture that coincidence theorists in their retard maxing stupors pretend were all built as advertised. Even in all of these old photographs, they're already standing when the rest of the city's barely there. Lot of curiosities to go over, and we're going over them in typical MINDSHOCK fashion, with logic and reason at the forefront, unlike anything else out there. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal, check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for topic requests of any kind. You can also be a guest in the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, rebuttals, debunkings. Leave them in the comments section, unless of course you're with us here live. Then drop them in the live chat. I'll try to get to all of them. And you can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Welcome, Scott Hawkins, B. Smarty, Franklin Loza Paredo. B. Smarty says, definitely the purple hooded lizard fellow. Yeah, there's a lot to go over here. So I've scavenged the interwebs for a couple different videos here covering this topic because we've gone over the evidence. Clearly there's a ton of funny business, like in some of these capitals, in some of these state capitals, like these government buildings, at the time they're alleged to have been constructed. I mean, there's a couple hundred people with horse and buggy, a couple Mormons with a wagon, supposedly building these like marble grand, just these architectural marvels of marble and stone, like single piece columns. Like, how are they transporting them from where? And all the coincidence there is bootleggers. They say, well, check the Wikipedia. Obviously the construction date must be correct. Retard maxing off the charts when it comes to Tartaria, perhaps the only topic more triggering than flat earth for all the authority worshipping cultists out there. The statists, the scientism cultists, goofs of all kind, the Stockholm Syndrome affected. Welcome, Sarah Catherine Adam Reed. Yeah, let's go over a couple of videos here. Some of these are AI narrated, but they brought up really good points that I haven't seen brought up. Before in this fashion, because so who laid claim and founded these nations? The Freemasons, who got the masonry for free. But who are they specifically? And what's going on with these orphan trains, etc. We talked about, I forgot which podcast were we talking about asylums, seeking asylum and actual asylums. Some people allege there were re-education facilities from the survivors from the previous reset. But there's definitely a lot to go over. Now, let's actually go over into a bunch of coincidences from Jared Boosters. Shout out Jared Boosters. A lot of good information on Jared Boosters' channel. Fair use here, obviously. Let's look at a bunch of these coincidences, and then we'll get into this AI narrated video, which I thought was very good.
Howdy y'all, welcome back. In keeping up with what I like to do on my channel, sharing with you different ideas, different theories, even different old world accepted narratives that most people will not talk about today or have not talked about in recent times, trying to put a more decisive sort of dive into what the history could actually mean. Theater, We have the theater of war, the theater of progression, the literal theater, like in ancient Rome, a construct in itself which elevated Romans from a conquering warrior culture to one that cultivated many of the aspects of society that are still in place today. However, have you ever heard of the coincidence of theater? More specifically, the vast assortment of so-called coincidences that reshaped America before the year 1900, all seemingly related to the actual theater or stage acting, but seemingly alluding to a much deeper, possibly calculated and orchestrated series of events meant to discombobulate the population and blur the line between the old world and the new. Today, I'll be attempting to highlight for you a multitude of coincidences, all of which coalesce rather unbelievably to create the current historical narrative.
And real quick, let's just do an etymological breakdown here of the Booth family, which he's going to get into. But real quick, so, just booths in general. Phone, booth, just, the word booth is quite curious. Obviously not as curious as fire and fare, paying your fare, F-A-R-E, F-A-I-R, world fairs, and fire. I mean, I need to do a clip of that because we went over that for like probably an hour straight on how weird that is. But the definition here, a booth is a small enclosed space, a temporary stall, or partitioned seating area. It can mean a market tent for selling goods, a private compartment like voting or phone box, or restaurant bench seating. So commercially, a trade show booth or market stall to display products or services. And a soundproof room used for audio recording could also be a sound booth or recording studio booth. So the main definition here on a small enclosed space. Also temporary stall. So going to Etym Online, so circa 1200, in places names temporary structure of board. So we have just a temporary status here. Seems to be the base of the root for booth. Especially a stall for the sale of goods or food or entertainment, like at a fair. From Old Danish bop, B-O-P, that is a strange P here, temporary dwelling, from East Norse boa, to dwell, from Proto-Germanic boan, from the P-I-E root behua, to be, exist, or grow. Very curious. Very curious. But let's continue.
In America. And oddly, all of these anomalies tie back to the theater. The Illuminati was founded on May 1st, 1776 in Europe. On May 1st, 1796, we are told a prodigal son was born in St. Pancras, London. St. Pancras, London sits at roughly the center of the ancient city and maybe one of the oldest portions of London, according to the narrative, with some of the evidence suggesting that the church was founded here as early as 314 AD, next to the fortified Roman encampment that was known as the Brill. Inside the ancient walls of this parish community in London, in the year 1796, Junius Brutus Booth Sr. was born. The
Brutus, huh?
Roman names and the birth date given for this gentleman are already a coincidence. However, we are also told that Junius's father, Richard Booth, was a staunch yet secretive supporter of the American patriot cause, all the while living inside the heart of London's religious community. The question becomes, are these individuals predetermined to fill certain roles in history, or are there clues in the narrative that could allude to this? Junius Brutus Booth Sr. would go on to be regarded as the greatest stage actor in the world during the early to mid 19th century. He was a household name according to the narrative, not just in Europe, but across all corners of civilization, so it becomes rather surprising that one of Booth Sr.'s most famous quotes is, and I quote, "I was destined by my controllers first for the printing office, then to be an architect, then to be a sculptor and modeler, then a lawyer, then a sailor. Of all of these, I preferred those of sculptor and modeler." End quote.
What? He's talking about his controllers? What does that mean? The controllers. Interesting. What else is curious? So, again, anybody, even on Wikipedia, this is mainstream narrative. This quote is mainstream narrative. Mainstream narrative here. So, he was the son of Richard Booth, who was a lawyer who was a strong supporter of the Patriot cause, and Jane Elizabeth Game, G-A-M-E. That's another interesting surname. This is straight from the wiki. While he was growing up, Booth's father tried to settle in his son in a lengthy succession of professions. Booth recalls of his childhood, this is the quote, "I was destined by my controllers, capital C, first for the printing office, then to be an architect, then sculptor, modeler, then a lawyer, then a sailor. Of all of these, I preferred those of sculptor and modeler." We never talked about the word sail and sailing. Selling, sailing, seller, sailor. Yeah, that's a coincidence stack too crazy for me. That's in the same category as clowns and clones.
In the multiple places that this quote was printed in the 19th century, the term controllers is always capitalized. That's why I use the term prodigal son. It's as if Booth Sr. was chosen for the role from inside a very tight-knit community in the heart of London. But the question becomes, by whom was he chosen? Who were these controllers? In 1813, at the age of 17, Junius Brutus Booth witnessed the play Othello at the Royal Opera House of London. Immediately, he gained his controller's.
And again, just a quick aside here, because I believe the etymological clues cannot be overlooked. Again, whether this is revelation of the method or whatever this is, or just a sick game of humiliation fetishism, to laugh at the peons and the peasants and the bootlickers, the Stockholm Syndrome coincidence theorists and authority-worshipping cultists. Londonium, in Latin, according to Cambridge Dictionary of English Place Names, means unexplained. Londonium means unexplained. Very curious. Very curious.
Blessings and began a career in acting. Just 1 year later, Booth had toured most of the Low Countries before being invited back to London in 1817 to make his debut at the Royal Opera House. That year, Junius Brutus Booth rose to worldwide acclaim when he played the role of Richard III. By 1821, he was said to be having an affair with a flower girl. He was caught, and subsequently he abandoned his wife and his son to flee to America. That sounds like the actors I know. By 1822, the couple had settled in Bel Air, Maryland, which is just about 20 minutes from where I'm recording this audio right now. We're told Booth then inherited, or came upon, roughly 150 acres in Maryland, formerly the stomping ground of the Susquehannock indigenous people, who were wiped out just a few years earlier in 1763, but I digress. So Booth lands on 150 rich acres of land. He builds or founds a log cabin, but then, quickly afterwards, he founds a massive 2-story home known as Tudor Hall. However, this isn't just any 2-story home. It's the classic old world style 2-story building where each story appears to be about 15 feet tall, and the overall building itself at only 2 stories is probably close to 50 feet tall or more. We're told Junius Brutus Booth was then immediately hired to again play Richard III in America, a role which he perfected over the next 30 years. Long story short, it appears Booth was part of some old world regime that was trickling into America, as there's still much debate over whether his plays were put on in French or in English.
Also, we have to stop this here just to look at all the variables here, right? Because this is still sort of part of the mainstream narrative that the colonists were founding colonies in the so-called New World. But was the New World really the Old World? So I really, I wish more videos would actually go into this, because there's tons of videos on how the New World was actually the Old World, but then when they're going over stuff in general, they just keep reiterating the mainstream narrative. Oh, he moved to the colonies. Well, what if this really weren't the colonies? Because if this is Old World Tartaria, it's not the New World. Unless if there's a line of demarcation of the exact topple of the Tartarian regime. I'm going over this in my The Real History of the World series. I need to do a new episode on that. Apparently the first major world war, some believe it's the Napoleonic Wars, but I'm going to take those out of the equation for a second. The Boxer Rebellion, so late 1890s into 1901, 1902, the Boxer Rebellion had so many nations involved. Was that the final squashing of Tartarian uprisings, Tartarian rebellions, the resistance, the Tartarian resistance? And was the Civil War more of some kind of manufactured cover-up, which continued into World War I, World War II? So the Civil War is kind of tricky. Or was the Civil War the last main clash of Tartaria? And then by the 1890s, it was just the rebellion, the rebels that were left over from the Civil War? Because if this is all worldwide conflict, and the Civil War was just obviously the whole slavery cover-up, it's hard. And more videos need to really label these narratives as we examine them, because perhaps he's not going to the colonies, he's going to the Old World here.
Seeing as he's an English actor from the heart of London, it's somewhat strange that he would perform in French at all, unless, much like John Levy has pointed out before, French appeared to be the predominant language that was universally being used before the rise of Napoleon, but was still being used afterwards in elite circles, even post-reset. Of course, it does appear to get deeper. For example, in 1835, Booth Sr., the predominant actor in the entire world at this time, wrote a letter to American President Andrew Jackson explicitly stating that he planned to cause Jackson's passing. If you didn't know, Andrew Jackson essentially looked to end the central bank and get America out of the control or the grip of the banking elites. But if we read between the lines, could those banking elites also have been controlling the media at the time, like the theaters and the newspapers? I think you know the answer. What's even stranger here is Andrew Jackson not only did not charge Booth with any crime for this, but he actually accepted Booth into a role in Washington. I wonder why. What leverage was really had there? Booth lived the remainder of his life touring both Europe and America, usually accompanied by some, but never all of his sons at the same time. Although he was an extremely well-educated, upper-class gentleman, we're told on a steamboat from New Orleans, where he had just performed in French, going to Cincinnati, Booth repeatedly drank river water, causing him to get violently ill. This specific steamboat, for whatever reason, was not carrying any doctors or medical supplies at the time, and Booth was said to have passed away in a rather ghastly fashion on the waters outside of Louisville, Kentucky. When his mistress came to claim his body, she said that she could barely recognize the person as being Booth. However, that's only the tip of an iceberg that pierces into the very heart of American culture. Junius Brutus Booth Sr. had 4 children of note, being his daughter Asia and his 3 sons, Brutus Jr., Edwin, and John Wilkes Booth. The firstborn of these children, Brutus Jr., was actually born in Charleston, South Carolina, and not on the family estate in Northern Maryland. While his acting career was rather elementary compared to his brothers, Brutus Jr. actually did garner worldwide acclaim by being the manager of 4 of the most important theaters in American history: the Boston Theater, the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, which since 1808 is the oldest continuously operating theater in America. He also managed the Winter Garden Theater, which is absolutely crucial to the narrative, but we'll get into that soon. And finally, he also managed the Booth Family Theater, or Booth's Theater, which even after the passing of Abe Lincoln, still grew to be one of the largest theaters in America after being founded in 1869. Which goes to show you that this Booth family was the predominant acting family in the world, with the 3 Booth sons being considered the greatest American stage actors of the 19th century. And that's why the events of the 1860s become so truly impossible to try to make sense of, because even after we lost a president, the Booth family still remained the predominant family when it came to acting. The Booth acting family was said to have retained most of its wealth and most of its popularity even after what happened to Lincoln.
That is pretty interesting, isn't it? Like a lot of coincidence theorists, they don't ask those questions. They don't really ask any questions, because I guess the Stockholm Syndrome is so extreme. There's just no mental capacity to ask these very, very important questions. Welcome, Jeff U1P, Adam Reed, Brian Cash, OIC. Anybody has any thoughts so far? Franklin asks, Bruce, what do you know about the chronology of Anatoly Fomenko? We've talked about him quite a bit. I have a whole video on him. Very, very smart guy. Very, very smart guy. I'm not sure. I do wonder if he ever updated anything after this whole explosion of all this stuff online. I think he's still alive. I don't know if he's ever made... Has he done any recent work post all of this explosion online? So, yeah. So right now it says... So he's 81 right now. That's what it says. No news on whether or not he died or not. So, yeah. I'm not sure. So the new chronology... Yeah, there's a lot of interesting questions raised, but I'm not sure... I don't know how much he touched upon resets and all of that.
Brutus Jr. managed these properties until he retired to Manchester by the Sea in New England in the year 1881. However, the next Booth brother really sets into motion the coincidences that don't exactly add up at all. And that isn't John Wilkes, but rather Edwin Booth. Edwin Booth was born on or around the Tudor Hall, the family estate in Bel Air, Maryland, in the year 1833. We're told through Edwin's own writings that his family was incredibly superstitious. In fact, the Booth family was written to have an incredible fear of ivy vines, and the family also believed that touching a peacock feather would curse an individual for a lifetime. To me, that sounds like some esoteric or occult beliefs being practiced by Father Booth and then instilled into his children, but I digress. Thinking about magic and alchemy, of all the Booth children, we're told that Edwin performed with his father on stage the most and would have picked up on his customs the most. The timeline is rather strange though. Some would say, in itself, the timeline is a coincidence. In 1849, Edwin Booth made his first starring appearance alongside his father in the highly regarded Richard III that was being shown in Boston. Nearly 1 year later to the day, Booth Sr. fell seriously ill, with some thinking he may have been poisoned. At that time, Edwin Booth took over his father's role as Richard III. Edwin was so successful in the role, even surpassing his father with amount of tickets sold, that Edwin began to fill in more and more roles that used to belong to his father. At the height of all of this in America, Booth Sr. then mysteriously passes away on the steamboat to Cincinnati, and directly after this, Edwin Booth travels the world to all the spots that made his father famous, essentially playing the exact same roles. This culminated in not only the Booth family being at the height of high society, but each member was so well known to society that we're told that many American families actually had photographs of the Booths in their homes.
So were Booths like the Kardashians of their time? For for all the Gen Z goofs. Were the Booths like the Kardashians? Now this is Jared Boosters. We've gone over some of his videos before. Adam Reed says Dave McGowan wrote a great piece on Lincoln assassination anomalies that go into Booth family's power in England and the USA. That's very interesting. I actually haven't seen that one. Is David McGowan kind of like the Miles Mathis? Are these two guys just like the leading publishers in the... Are they the most prolific in the conspiracy sphere of writing the most amount? I mean, Miles Mathis has wrote how many papers? I mean, crazy prolific. David McGowan, I knew he did a bit, but I don't know how far... You know, how much he's covered. It sounds like he's covered quite a bit.
Much like kids today keep sports or trading cards, everyone who was anyone could recognize the Booths by both their face and their name, which was said to be an astounding feat for the 19th century. And this is how the narrative goes on to build up the Booth family. Like they were the most famous people in America, or at least one of the most famous families in the 19th century. So it becomes somewhat shocking that by the year 1864, we're told the three brothers Booth, Brutus Jr., Edwin, and John Wilkes had still never performed in any play together. This is when the true coincidence, the meat and potatoes of this video takes place, because Edwin at this time arranged for him and his brothers for one night and one night only, which is where that saying arises from. The brothers put on a one night only showing of the tragedy of Julius Caesar.
Does that raise an eyebrow for anybody? So the Brutuses are putting on a show of Julius Caesar. Very interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Which, as you guessed it, is about the great leader of Rome being betrayed by his closest compatriots who call him a tyrant. It mirrors what happened to Abraham Lincoln. The play was held on November 25th, 1864, at the height of the Civil War. Now listen to these coincidences. November 25th at this time was a holiday in the state of New York, celebrating the anniversary of when the British stopped occupying New York City during the War of 1812, Evacuation Day. Because of this reason, the play was held on this exact date for one day only. The play, Julius Caesar, was said to have been chosen for unknown reasons, but many claim that Edwin may have had knowledge of his brother's plan for the president. However, modern scholars will tell you that's simply not true. More on that in just a little bit. Others, including Edwin Booth himself, later claimed that Julius Caesar was chosen because the play was said to have been held to raise money for a bronze statue of William Shakespeare to be erected in the newly founded Central Park. That also doesn't really make much sense logically. For example, Central Park was on the outskirts of the city at the time and was not being heavily used. The tickets for the play were said to have cost at least $5 each, an unprecedented amount for that time. Although the Civil War was raging, including in New York, Julius Caesar sold out almost immediately, with the Winter Garden being packed to the brim. The Winter Garden Theater was the premier theater of New York from its founding in 1850 through its demolition in 1867. The Winter Garden, also sometimes referred to as Metropolitan Hall, is literally cited as being founded exclusively for a singer named Jenny Lind to come to America. However, again, nothing here really adds up if you look at it. Artistic depictions of the New York Winter Garden Theater from around 1850 not only show the building as a complex theater with Roman-style architecture, elaborate facades with striking sculptures and statues, but the Garden Theater is also drawn with a massive dome on top. The address was 667 Broadway, and the completed structure was said to have the largest stage in New York at that time. Yet, nobody seems to know who built this structure, or more importantly, who paid to found this structure. The narrative claims it was P.T. Barnum, yet that also doesn't really compute. The beauty of having multiple different narratives here to compare and contrast is that you begin to see that history is never what it seems. While most of you may have a good idea about P.T. Barnum and who he was, it is worth note that he began his career first writing newspapers and then sharing historical and scientific anomalies. It's almost as if he was planted into his role. Upon landing in Manhattan...
What? As if the whole world is a circus? Alright, hold on a second here. Hold on a second. So, yeah, I need to do, in the Real History of the World series, I have an episode on the Roman Empire and all things Rome. Again, another curious word, Rome, R-O-M-E, R-O-A-M, all roads lead to Rome. Roman of Rome, the Romanovs of Russia, Romanov of Rome. I mean, there's a lot to go over there, of course. But, just real quick, so the whole play about Julius Caesar and the betrayal, if the dates are all off, I wonder how recent it would have been. If they're putting on this play in the 1800s, were all the events of Julius Caesar not that long before? Like, why would they be named after Brutus? Like, if it was more in the recent past, that makes a little bit more sense, but...
In 1834, Barnum purchased a museum of American history, said to have been full of indigenous artifacts that he used to create a cabinet of curiosities which he marketed as of supernatural origin. That's pretty much all we have on the guy until this Jenny Lind comes along to America. Jenny Lind, also known as Madame Goldschmidt, a very telling name. But Jenny Lind was said to be the most famous opera singer of the mid-19th century, referred to in newspapers as Madame Goldschmidt, the Swedish Nightingale. We're told that P.T. Barnum, with only the money from his little newspaper and his museum of indigenous artifacts, which he called oddities, he somehow had enough money to not only finance the construction of the massive, old world, Romanesque Winter Garden Theater in New York, but he was also said to have had enough money to pay Jenny Lind about $3,000 to come to America, plus, and I don't see this as possible, he paid her an additional $1,000 a night for 150 consecutive nights of her performances. 1,000 a night in the year 1850 is equivalent to roughly $39,000 a night today. Meaning, with just a museum salary, P.T. Barnum built an entire domed old world theater and then paid Jenny Lind what would have been the equivalent to nearly $6 million cash in just over 150 days. We're told Barnum then founded the first aquarium in America as part of his museum. He was part of launching America's first official wax figure department, documenting the deceased. And I can't imagine all of the other things that we truly don't know about his history. But I digress. The Winter Garden Theater apparently lost the dome by the time of the first photographs, having been partially burnt down in 1854. However, much earlier, in 1850, during the opening ceremonies, the Winter Garden Theater in New York was the location for several meetings of the highest-ranking Freemasons in the world, even being described later in 1899 as the landmark location where the 1850 meetings changed the history of New York and all of Freemasonry.
It's kind of weird how that's openly admitted in mainstream history. Like, this is the mainstream narrative. Jeff UNP asks, first controlled op? I don't know about first. I don't know. It seems like if everything's been a controlled op from the beginning, or if everyone's been controlled op by the controllers.
Oddly, after being home to P.T. Barnum and Freemason rituals, the Winter Garden became a theater that focused exclusively on female talent, run by Laura Keene. Laura Keene was a key player in the American theater as well, and Laura Keene was actually the lead actress in a very important play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, which was attended by Lincoln the night that he was assassinated. Isn't it strange, then, that after Laura Keene owned the Winter Garden Theater in New York, it then passed into the hands of the Booth family in 1863. It gets even stranger, as the Julius Caesar play I mentioned earlier is really the first major event held by the Booths in the Winter Garden. It's as if all of these events had been orchestrated behind the scenes long before they actually occurred. The Julius Caesar play was dedicated directly to Father Booth Sr. and was said to fill the long mourning of the country over losing their most beloved actor. However, it also seems like more nefarious motives may have been at play. The Winter Garden Theater was beyond capacity on the night of the play. The most elite, the richest of New York's Unionists were in attendance at this one-night-only event. The profits from the play, at $5 or more a ticket, had been the greatest ever seen in New York theater up until that time. The play, which is about Caesar being betrayed by his closest friends and family, had the key roles played by the Booth brothers. And Booth, John Wilkes, would go on to end Lincoln's life at Ford's Theater, while Lincoln was attending a play where the lead actress was the former owner of the Winter Garden Theater. In Caesar, which was held at the Winter Garden Theater, the night of the Winter Garden Julius Caesar, which was above capacity with the richest Unionists inside, the buildings surrounding the Winter Garden Theater were set ablaze by Confederate sympathizers. Apparently, the smoke began to enter the Winter Garden Theater in what appears to have been a blatant attempt to eliminate certain people. But it gets even stranger. The Booth brothers ostensibly forced everyone to remain in the theater at the time, claiming that the Winter Garden was built of old world materials and could survive any fire. Whether this was a ploy to keep those inside, as to seal their fate, we may never know, as the fire truly was unable to breach the Winter Garden's thick stone walls. However, the story is as ridiculous as it is convoluted. So, the brothers Booth, led by Edwin, put on a play dedicated to their father, who passed away somewhat mysteriously, but also, this play was to fund a statue in Central Park, which nobody was using quite yet. The play was about the cult-like leader of Rome who reshaped Rome and then is taken out by those closest to him.
I mean, let's just take another moment here. How difficult it is to carve this out of stone or marble or whatever? I mean, this is incredible. And another thing, like, if these skies have all been edited out, like, look how flat and uniform the sky is. It's as if it's been airbrushed or whatever. How many aircraft were in the sky here? How many airships? UFO / airships / whatever. How does that change our perception of this century? If that's what was going on in the sky and people were constantly coming and going in airships. Fascinating.
However, the story is as ridiculous as it is convoluted. So, the brothers Booth, led by Edwin, put on a play dedicated to their father, who passed away somewhat mysteriously, but also, this play was to fund a statue in Central Park, which nobody was using quite yet. The play was about the cult-like leader of Rome who reshaped Rome and then is taken out by those closest to him. The Booths were known to be somewhat friendly or acquainted with the Lincolns, and Edwin Booth once rescued Tad Lincoln, Abe's son, after Tad had fallen onto train tracks. The Lincolns would often attend events put on by the Booths, and they greatly enjoyed their theater. John Wilkes Booth, the most famous actor of the 19th century alongside his brothers, plays in this Julius Caesar play for one night only, and then 4 months later, he would end the life of Lincoln at a play being held by the previous owner of the Winter Garden Theater. Directly after the shot, witnesses say that Booth jumped from the presidential suite to the stage below and recited, word for word, the lines that Brutus said in the play after stabbing Caesar, the same lines that would also happen to go on and be part of the motto of Virginia as well. It is also noted that some onlookers mention that Wilkes Booth, after reciting his lines from Julius Caesar, then pointed at the president and yelled something that began with the word free. Some people claim he yelled Freemason when pointing at the president. Others claim he yelled freedom, which is usually what historians agree upon. However, others also claim that he pointed at Lincoln and yelled freedman, the latter being another term for a freed, enslaved person.
Interesting. I mean, the greatest freedom cry was probably Mel Gibson and Braveheart, right? I mean, that one will echo through history. Yeah. I mean, how many movies have been made regarding Lincoln's assassination? Because it always seems like it wasn't that many, right? Like, compared to other historical events, like the moon landing or whatever. There's like almost no movies about the moon landing. I mean, you have Lincoln Vampire Hunter, but... So it says Lincoln here was a character in 350 movies, but not that many are about the assassination. And then there's a few biopics, which of course would have to feature the assassination, but specifically about the assassination, not that many. Maybe a dozen in all of history. That's kind of weird, right? And it seems like, yeah, that's kind of weird.
According to Walt Whitman, a contemporary of Lincoln, known for his accuracy to detail, whom lived next to Lincoln for multiple years in Washington, he describes Lincoln multiple times as a completely dark-skinned individual, echoing other writers of the time, and John Wilkes Booth, who apparently in private referred to the president as darker than most indigenous people. While there's a lot of apparent prejudice we can see in this narrative, there's also a lot we can deduce there. For one, modern scholars have argued many different theories, but one is that Abe may have been of the Melungeon stock, being a secretive caste of people, and later coming to be a negative term to describe a lost group of people from the heart of Appalachia with extremely European-looking features, but skin that seems to be darker than their indigenous counterparts. The origin and history of the Melungeon people is all but forgotten today, and most of the time you can't even really talk about the history without being ostracized, so I hope I'm not, but I digress, because things here are going to get even more coincidental. John Wilkes Booth got his first major acting gig at the Holiday Street Theater in Baltimore in 1855, which just so happened to be owned by John T. Ford, the same man who owned Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. What a coincidence. Wilkes Booth rose to prominence playing Native Americans inside theaters that were owned by John T. Ford. However, most regard his one-night performance as Brutus alongside his brothers to be the performance of his lifetime. It's as if he knew already of his plan for Lincoln. The question becomes, did the rest of his family know? And how much, if any, of this 19th century theater can actually be trusted? For example, as mentioned earlier, the Booths were considered household names, with John Wilkes described as the most handsome man in America and a natural genius. For example, Walt Whitman again describes Abe Lincoln as being dark in his complexion, but Whitman also describes John Wilkes Booth as being both a genius and the most, quote, classically handsome man in America. What's strange here is, sources are very conflicting. Many narrators state that John Wilkes Booth was outspoken in his support of the southern states from the beginning of the Civil War, so much so that he lost friends and acting roles in the North. We're told Wilkes Booth received hundreds of letters every day from infatuated female fans, all the while touring exclusively throughout the Northeast in these Union strongholds.
That's hilarious. So he has groupies. So this guy has groupies and crazed fans, kind of like serial killers or rebels, outlaws. I mean, that's hilarious.
It doesn't really add up. Some have proposed that John Wilkes Booth may have been a spy of sorts, although determining the exact trajectory of his actions before 1865 is rather difficult. For example, the narrative claims he was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, and yet he acted throughout the North in Union strongholds, which would have been a conflict of interest, especially towards the latter part of the war. Furthermore, Lincoln apparently attended at least a few of Wilkes Booth's performances, with one in November of 1864 being at Ford's Theater, where Wilkes Booth was said to have apparently pointed at the president in disgust.
I mean, I don't know if they're going to go over this. I'm surprised he hasn't mentioned it before, but according to the official narrative, John Wilkes Booth was actually initiated into the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society whose initial objective was to acquire territories as slave states in late 1860. I don't know why he didn't mention this. So this was a secret society founded in 1854. The objective, again, according to the official mainstream narrative, the objective was to expand the U.S., the United States, into Latin America, adding slave states and ensuring the permanent continuance of slavery. This later became a plan for the southern states to secede and then add Latin American territory. The Golden Circle was a circle of 16 degrees radius above 2,400 miles centered on Havana and covering territories whose climate was suitable for large-scale plantation agriculture. It would have consisted of the southern United States, Mexico, which was to be divided into 25 new slave states, Central America, Cuba, Haiti, and Dominican Republic, Caribbean, South America, and most other islands in the Caribbean. Quite the curiosity. I mean, this is all according to the official narrative, which of course we cannot believe in any way, but it's curious to dissect it just to see what the official narrative is. So this is a map of the aim of this secret society, the Knights of the Golden Circle. So John Wilkes Booth was initiated, allegedly, late 1860. So, very interesting. Very interesting. So, I mean, again, this is all official narrative, but after he escapes, so he escapes the theater. So this guy assassinates the president and gets away. He assassinates the president, gets away. And again, according to the official narrative, this is his route here. So, shoots Lincoln April 14th, 1865. So 5 years after his initiation into the Knights of the Golden Circle. And then he flees here. Goes to Surratt Tavern, picked up weapons, midnight April 14th, 1865. Gets to Maryland, home of Dr. Mudd. Sets his leg, April 15th, 1865. Makes it to the home of Samuel Cox. Sought help here, April 16th, 1865. Stayed in the woods, April 16th to 21. And home of Colonel Hughes. Landed here mistakenly, having gone upriver rather than across to Virginia. That's kind of weird. You would think an expert, if he's some kind of expert spy. Then goes to Lucas's farm, slept in cabin, April 23rd, 1865. Makes it to Garrett's farm, arrived April 24th, 1865, and killed April 26th, 1865. This is the official narrative. So, again, let's keep that in mind.
Still, no one at the time apparently suspected a thing, and John Wilkes Booth kept being hired in the North, all the while touring through the United States under the auspices of acting, but really, he appeared to also be gathering information to try to take Lincoln out of the White House. That is, according to the current narrative.
Anthony at ECF says, oh, okay, that is the official narrative you were reading. I almost had to share with you that the Civil War did not start over slavery, but instead the taxation on cotton. Not exactly. It was just overall taxation on everything. If there are any coincidence, there's any bootlickers in the chat who are not aware that the victors write the history books, we could do a quick little footnote here. Quick little footnote. For all the goofs, I got all the receipts here for all the goofs, because it's a triggering topic. Like authority worshipping cultists, bootlickers, anything that they learned in indoctrination facilities, if you say something that doesn't match, they get insta-triggered. Like these brain-dead goofs, these retard maxers get insta-triggered. So this is the per capita tariff incidence. So you could see the South is disproportionately holding the tax burden. Now keep in mind, 90 plus, 95 plus, 97 plus, I mean, could be up to 99%, depending on which census estimates you're looking at. Anywhere between 90 and 99% of Southerners own no slaves. These are poor farmers trying to provide for their family, being taxed disproportionately. So this is like Revolutionary War 2.0. Because the North wanted the South to subsidize industrialization. So the average Southerner is paying 2.5 times the tax of the average Northerner. Like, and again, a lot of these brain dead bootlickers, they hallucinate that somehow 99% non-slave owners are going to go to war over slavery to keep slavers they don't have. And it's not because they're being taxed up the wazoo. So Revolutionary War 1.0, it's like a 2% tax on tea. That's the end of the war. The end of the world. They're going to war. But 250% general tax on everything versus Northerners, they're supposed to not go to war? Like, what kind of retard maxer is going to hallucinate this had anything to do with slavery? So you want all the receipts here. So, and these are all official narrative receipts, by the way. This is all mainstream sources for the goofs that hallucinate. This is like crazy conspiracy theorists on GeoCities blogs. So, Southerners bore 1.5 to 3 times the per capita federal tax burden, primarily through tariffs, not through direct taxes. So Frank W. Taussig, Harvard economist, the incidence of the tariff fell more heavily on the agriculture exporting regions than on the manufacturing states. Tariff History of the United States, 1910, page 84 to 86. We have Douglas C. North, Nobel Prize winning economic historian. The South, as a region specializing in exports and dependent upon imports and manufacturers, bore a disproportionate share of the tariff burden. This is the economic growth of the United States, 1790 to 1860, published 1961, chapter 6. Gavin Wright, although custom revenues were collected largely in northern ports, the economic burden of tariffs was shifted towards southern consumers through prices. The political economy of the Cotton South, 1978, page 35 to 38. James M. McPherson, mainstream Civil War historians, tariffs have long been a source of southern grievance because they were perceived, with some justification, to impose heavier costs on the South than the North. Battle Cry of Freedom, 1988, page 91. And again, if 90 to 99% of Southerners didn't even have slaves. So what would this have to do with slavery? And again, just in our super quick examination of the true cause here, the Corwin Amendment is the smoking gun that all these brain-dead retard maxers hallucinate didn't exist. So the Corwin Amendment, the North was actually willing. The Corwin Amendment Joint Resolution number 80, second session of the 36th Congress. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state, with the domestic institution slavery thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. Now again, all the retard maxers, they're that brain dead that they don't know that the Corwin Amendment was actually passed by the northern states, not the southern states. So the North was willing to grant the South slavery in perpetuity forever if there's no war. And the southern states rejected it because the war was obviously not about slavery. If it was about slavery, why would they just not accept this? Mr. Lincoln has advised that the Republicans of his state should support Mr. Corwin's constitutional amendment, which passed the House prohibiting Congress from interfering with the domestic institutions of the South. Can this be any more obvious? How many retard maxers don't know how obvious this is? And you could look all of this up, the Corwin Amendment, etc. And so this was all agreed to by the northern states. So the northern states had no issue with slavery. They were actually more prejudiced than the southern states. And more racist, obviously. Could also look at some of Lincoln's quotes here. I will say that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am now not, nor have I ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition, Onto this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races from living together in terms of social and political equality, and inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. So a lot of these brain dead goofs that hallucinate that the Southerners were the one who were racist, it was actually the Northerners. Like, the Southerners actually paid, like the Confederacy actually paid equal wages to black soldiers, both free blacks and otherwise. And yeah, there were actually free black men who fought for the Confederacy, because this was Revolutionary War 2.0. Man, we went off on a tangent here. And I have a bunch of receipts here. We went over them on a bunch of lives. There are black Confederate historians whose grandfathers fought for the Confederacy, blowing the whistle on, all these false narratives. So, anyway, let's continue here. Fair use, obviously.
Then we have the Julius Caesar play, held at the New York Winter Theater, and the rest is history. However, I'm pretty sure there's deeper factions at play here than just the North and the South. For example, in 1859, Booth stole a uniform from the militia known as the Richmond Greys. Then he snuck into the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. We have no evidence of this other than alleged letters and journal entries. Similar stories occur in 1860, when we're told that Wilkes Booth, the most famous actor in America, drafted up a long speech to be delivered to Congress denouncing Lincoln and supporting the South. Apparently, he decided to never deliver this address. According to a biography that was assisted by his sister Asia, Wilkes Booth was working as a spy from even before the war began, and he had used his connections to become a leading smuggler of anti-malaria medicine into the South. John Wilkes Booth, the apparent most famous and handsome man in America, then became infatuated with Lucy Lampert Hale. As the story goes, Wilkes Booth was openly outspoken about supporting the South and hating the North, yet he lived in the North. He performed for rich Unionists exclusively, and his inner circle were almost all Northerners. But adding to this somewhat weird coincidence is his relationship with Lucy Hale. Her father, John Parker Hale, was a staunch Unionist and would have never allowed his daughter to even think of courting a Southerner, let alone marrying one. The same goes, according to this narrative, with pretty much every aspect of high society in the North. Anyone who opposed the Union openly would be ostracized from society and even arrested in some cases. So it becomes a bit unexplainable how John Wilkes Booth openly detested the North as the most famous man in America and still was able to be so popular. It's almost as if there's more to this history that's right below the surface, but no major narrative will get into it.
It was almost like Andrew Tate, right? Like, totally anti-establishment while he was gallivanting the world.
John Wilkes Booth was allegedly a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society in the South which desired to unite all of North America into one larger super kingdom that would be focused on plantations, trade, and high society. However, it doesn't really make sense because, again, we're looking at Lucy Hale, who either married or was engaged to John Wilkes Booth. Any Northerner that we have in this discussion, none of them appear to have any idea that John Wilkes Booth had these feelings about the North or Lincoln, yet we're told in the narrative and other narratives here that are tied to this one that John Wilkes Booth was open in his feelings. So which one is it? Because you can't really have both. There's conflicting reports here, and I don't think they could both be true. And what even is this idea that we're looking at here when we're talking about the transition of power and the transition that goes from the old world technology, really, to the new world technology. Through these new technologies, we can see that the theater of war begins to take shape in an entirely new light. We have things like the Underground Railroad that come up as a network for moving people who were looking to go to the north to become free. But according to reports, we also have stops on this network that were known from the Confederacy side, and they were also places where the secret society known as the Knights of the Golden Circle were active. We have John Wilkes Booth, who led a major unit in Montreal of these Knights of the Golden Circle, apparently, and they were looking to combat the Norse power. It's almost like a Fight Club situation where John Wilkes Booth was traveling throughout these secret societies and strongholds in the North after his Julius Caesar appearance in the play in November of 1864. But from 1864, following the Julius Caesar play, what Wilkes Booth was doing is rather confusing. He was visiting these strongholds throughout North America, apparently trying to put a plan into action, but he was also the most famous man, or one of them, in the country at the time. He was one of the most well-known faces, so it sort of makes all of his clandestine operations seem almost impossible. Nothing about the narrative adds up. Wilkes Booth attended Lincoln's second inauguration as a family friend, as the +1 to Lucy Hale. Mind you, Lucy Hale and her Northern Unionist family either didn't know about or accepted Wilkes Booth and his beliefs, but it becomes apparent that the narrative says he had constant outbursts directed at the president and at the North, and these were, quote, publicly documented. So which one is it? We're told that Wilkes Booth began to set his plan in stone on April 11th of 1865, when Lincoln officially announced the 15th Amendment, giving freedmen and all men the right to vote. But the timeline here is really strange, because Wilkes Booth had a residence, apparently, at Ford's Theater, meaning he was quite literally living at the theater, or he was receiving all of his mail to the theater. That's what's really strange here. It makes you wonder if this plot, if the theater, didn't actually go much deeper than what we've been told in the current narrative today. On Good Friday, April 14th of 1865, Wilkes Booth spoke with the mail carrier at Ford's Theater, who mentioned to Booth that President Lincoln would be in attendance that evening.
So the theater of war going on at the theater.
To see the play being put on by their mutual friend, Laura Keene. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, is what Booth exclaimed after delivering the fatal blow. Throughout his escape, Booth and his fellow conspirators are said to have done one thing that was really clear, and they used the help of freedmen. At least 3 known freedmen, from what I read, were involved in this plot, and they assisted Wilkes Booth in his plan and his attempted getaway.
I mean, it was probably a whole lot more than 3. Adam Reed in the chat says, like I mentioned earlier, ex-Prime Minister of UK Tony Blair's wife is a Booth. So this leads even more credence to this news. Also, it's definitely a theater we live in. Wow. That's crazy. Wow. That's wild. We're going to get into that. That's actually going to segue nicely into the next video. That's going to segue quite nicely into the next video. And Booth is actually not that common of a... I mean, how many people have known somebody with the last name Booth? I don't think I can recall a single person. And yeah, I just checked it. Cherry Lady Blair Booth. Born 54. Married Tony Blair 1980. Her father was Tony Booth. English actor. His mother, okay, his father worked as a merchant seaman during the Second War, was a Catholic convert. So, wow. And so he was married 4 times, had 8 children. It doesn't even state, does it state his father's name here? It doesn't even state his father's name. Huh. Booth. So, Anthony George Tony Booth? What? This guy has 2 middle names? Who just happens to have Tony. Well, Tony's kind of a popular name, but that's still an interesting coincidence. So his father was George Henry Booth. Merchant seaman. Born 1907. There was another George Henry Booth, 1833 to 1911, who moved to Utah. Father was John William Booth. And then there's also Henry Booth, the first Earl of Warrington in the 1600s. So the father of George Henry Booth was also George Henry Booth. How many George Henry Booths were there? Interesting. Very interesting. So, supposedly, so allegations were, they said it was a rumor, so I'm just doing an AI deep dive. AI is saying it's a rumor so that John Wilkes Booth was a distant uncle of the British actor Tony Booth, making him the great-great-great-granduncle to Sherry Blair. But they said it was debunked again. Brother, so Algernon Sidney Booth, brother to John Wilkes Booth's father, actually died in 1803 as a young child. Because he could not have moved to Liverpool, while both families originated from the UK. Any actual shared ancestry between George Henry Booth's Liverpool family and the American theatrical Booth family would date back much further to untraceable distant roots. Interesting. Interesting.
Seemingly indicating that there was a much deeper root here than just north versus south, and there was a much deeper reason for Wilkes Booth trying to commit this atrocity and get away. Something that goes completely against the mainstream narrative, and I think that this really all ties back to the old world. A $100,000 reward was set for the capture of John Wilkes Booth.
Adam Reed says the news about Sherry Blair Booth is the Dave McGowan piece is definitely worth a read. He said it's definitely the same bloodline. So I wonder if it's not through Algeron, through the uncle. It would have had to be through somebody else then if the uncle died. So it would be curious if he named that somebody else, if he traced it. Jeff UNP says Blair created the whole Russia-Ukraine thing allegedly or made it blow up. Maybe that's also a thread just brainstorming.
America's most famous actor, and now its biggest villain. That is what the theater really was. Instead of being taken alive and brought in for questioning, as was ordered by the American government, we're told Wilkes Booth, upon being backed into a barn and nearly caught, insisted, and he did this through verbal communication, on having a final battle with the detectives, and he lost his life. Lincoln's funeral was then paraded through nearly every major American city in the North and the Midwest for the next 6 months, being one of the most profitable deaths of all time. Trace the money, trace the coincidences, trace the evidence, and we shall begin to see why the theater of war, the theater of politics, the theater of society, and the theater itself all appear to be one and the same.
It appears to all be a big show. Alright, so here's the segue. So here's the video. It's AI narrated. I don't think Jared Boosters is AI. So this is an AI video. Who inherited the cities? So, it's AI narrated, but it brings up some very interesting points that I want to go over. Which I think is a major piece of the puzzle here.
With something small. A photograph. Black and white. Dated 1867. It shows a street in St. Louis, Missouri, a broad, immaculate boulevard flanked by enormous neoclassical buildings. Columns 3 stories tall. Ornate stonework. Arched windows stretching 20, 30 feet high. And standing in front of these impossible structures that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build even today, are people in rough clothing, muddy boots, improvised frontier wear. They look like settlers. They look like people who arrived recently, people who are still figuring out where they are. And I thought, who built those buildings? That question sounds simple. It isn't. The official explanation that American settlers, barely 2 generations removed from log cabins and dirt roads, constructed what were effectively the grandest buildings in the world across dozens of cities simultaneously without advanced engineering schools, without a trained architectural labour force, and in many cases without coherent records of construction. The official explanation collapses here. Not under the weight of accusation, under the weight of arithmetic. So I started looking, and the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Because this wasn't just St. Louis. It wasn't just America. It wasn't even just the 19th century. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. On every continent, across hundreds of cities spanning at least 300 years of what we call modern history. Grand buildings without builders, established cities without founding populations, infrastructure without engineers. And in nearly every case, nearly every single case, a curious absence of transitional documentation. No blueprints, no payroll records, no generational accounts of the work in progress. No grandfather telling his grandson, I helped build that dome. I cut that marble. I laid that foundation. The silence was deafening, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me introduce you to a concept that historians call settlement. Settlement, as we understand it, describes the process by which people move into an uninhabited or sparsely populated region and, over generations, build the infrastructure of civilization: roads, courts, markets, cathedrals, administrative buildings, hospitals. The process is slow, messy, and extensively documented because it involves thousands of ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in real time. And those people write letters, keep diaries, complain to their governments, and leave behind the sprawling, contradictory, thoroughly human paper trail of genuine historical process. Now look at what we actually have in the historical record for dozens of major world cities in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Chicago, incorporated as a town in 1833, a city in 1837. By 1893, 56 years later, it hosted the world's Columbian Exposition in a complex of gleaming white neoclassical palaces, so vast and so perfectly executed that visitors called it the White City, and many openly wept at its beauty. 56 years. For context, it took the city of Florence approximately 200 years to complete the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Chicago allegedly produced something comparable in scope, in finish, in architectural sophistication, in less than 6 decades by a population that was still in living memory, sleeping in tents. This raises a simple but critical question. Who taught them? Not the concept of architecture, not the aspiration toward grandeur. I mean the specific technical material knowledge required to quarry, transport, cut and assemble stone on that scale, to engineer load-bearing arches without modern cranes, to produce the mathematically precise decorative programs that adorn these buildings from foundation to cornice. That knowledge takes generations to develop and transmit. It lives in apprenticeship traditions, in guild systems, in family lineages of craftsmen who pass their techniques from father to son across centuries. Where are those lineages? And that's where the inheritance problem becomes impossible to ignore. I'm not the first person to notice the gap. Scattered across the historiographical record, in the footnotes of academic papers, in the fine print of municipal incorporation documents, in the margin notes of 19th century land surveys, there are names, the same names, recurring across cities, across continents, across what should be entirely separate and unconnected historical processes. I want to be careful here. I am not naming conspirators. I am not pointing fingers. What I am doing is asking, why do certain family names appear at the founding moments of so many major institutions, so many major cities, so many major financial structures, in so many different parts of the world at virtually the same historical moment?
So, I don't know exactly how connected this is to the 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati. You can even find this document on CIA.gov for all the bootlicking goofs who hallucinate it's all made up nonsense. But, yeah, it is curious. It's very curious how this all started, what happened after the reset, because we're missing so much information. But this particular video is very interesting, and it's asking all the right questions. It's asking all the right questions. Yeah, so what I just traced on AI, which could be wrong, is that Algernon Booth died as a child, or whoever the intermediary relative was, so it couldn't have been him, so it has to be a different connection. So they could still be related, but possibly not that connection. Not Algernon. Unless that the AI is wrong, but apparently there's a record that he died. But it was interesting because AI said they could still be related. It just wouldn't be through Algernon. So it didn't seem like it was an anti-propaganda piece saying, oh yeah, they're definitely not related. It just kind of said that it wasn't Algernon. But obviously it still could have been. I mean, we're looking at mainstream info.
The 1800s were a period of what historians blandly describe as consolidation, land consolidation, banking consolidation, industrial consolidation. What they mean, what the documents actually show, when you read them carefully, is that enormous quantities of pre-existing wealth, pre-existing infrastructure, and pre-existing legal authority passed into the hands of a relatively small number of dynastic families in an extraordinarily compressed period of time. Not through conquest, which leaves records, not through purchase, which leaves receipts, not through inheritance in the conventional sense, which leaves wills and estates and probate records. Through something that the documents describe almost universally as acquisition. Acquisition. A word so vague it means everything and nothing. A word that papers over what might be the largest transfer of assets in human history. The deeper I went into the specific mechanics of these acquisitions, the more a pattern emerged. The families, and there appear to be, in various formulations across different researchers and different documentary traditions, somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 13 core dynastic groupings, at the apex of this process, these families did not simply acquire wealth. They acquired the apparatus of civilization itself, the buildings, the land under the buildings, the legal frameworks that determined who could own what, the financial instruments that denominated value, the publishing houses that shaped what could be known and said about the past, the educational institutions that trained the people who would one day become the experts on that past. Not wealth, not influence, not power in the conventional sense. Everything. Here is a detail that stops most people cold the first time they encounter it. In the 1800s, across North America and parts of Europe and Australia, official census records and municipal documents repeatedly describe cities, real, named, geographically located cities, as having been in some prior period either entirely uninhabited or inhabited by a population that had, in the language of the documents, declined, dispersed, or been removed. The word removed appears with unsettling frequency. What does it mean for a city to be removed of its inhabitants? A city is not a tent. A city is stone and iron and glass and sewage systems and graveyards and foundations sunk 20 feet into the earth. A city is the accumulated physical expression of centuries of human life. You cannot simply remove the inhabitants of a city and then, a generation later, introduce new inhabitants and expect the historical record to show nothing but a clean break and a fresh start. And yet, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston in some of its older quarters, Constantinople, renamed, repurposed, restaffed. The cities of the American Midwest, supposedly built from nothing in a generation. The cities of the Russian interior, whose architectural vocabulary is identical to that of Western European cities built.
Another curiosity, the word city itself. From late Latin citatem, or nominative civitas, or civitatem. Originally citizenship, condition, or rights of a citizen, membership in the community, and later community of citizen state, commonwealth. Commonwealth. Wealth that is commonly shared? Commonly shared by whom? So a commoner or a common man would be like a lowly peasant, a commoner, not like a king or royalty. From Old French commune, common, general, free, open, public. Shared by all or many. Held in common or together. Shared by all. And wealth from mid-20th century, 12th century, state or condition of happiness, well-being, or joy. And that's the obsolete sense. Now it is valuable material possessions, prosperity, and abundance. Isn't that curious? So it used to be the commonwealth. So did they have cathedrals, cathedrals with organs, healing everybody with frequencies and free energy everywhere, where everybody lives prosperous, potentially in the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ? and then everything transferred to Satan's little season, where it went from the state or condition of happiness to valuable material possessions and materialism, Satan Saturn worship. Big questions. I do not claim to have answers.
Built supposedly centuries earlier by entirely different civilizational traditions, with no documented point of cultural transfer. The cities of South America, whose colonial era buildings display a technical refinement that the documented labour forces of the colonial period could not plausibly have produced. In each of these cases, the same structure applies. A prior population, sometimes acknowledged, usually vague, occasionally described in dismissive terms as primitive or sparse, disappears from the record. A new population arrives and is described in official documents as founding or settling what is clearly an already built environment. And standing in the background of every founding moment, every incorporation document, every first city council, every initial land grant, a small number of family names with pre-existing capital, pre-existing legal standing, and a remarkably complete understanding of exactly which assets were worth acquiring. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And here's the strangest part. The new settlers themselves often seem to know something is missing. American frontier writing from the mid-1800s is full of an odd melancholy, a sense of ruins, a sense of grandeur that preceded the writer and that the writer cannot explain. Walt Whitman writes of American cities with a reverence that sits oddly against the official timeline, as though he is describing something ancient rather than something new. Washington Irving's landscapes are haunted not by imagined ghosts, but by something more specific, by the feeling of prior habitation, of a world that was furnished before the current occupants arrived. What did they sense that the official record cannot account for? This is the point where the standard counter-argument arrives. People were simply building things, the counter-argument goes. Humans have always been capable of remarkable construction. Look at the Egyptian pyramids, look at the Roman aqueducts, look at the Gothic cathedrals. Why should the 19th century be different? I take that point seriously. I want to take it seriously. But the Gothic cathedrals were built over centuries by known guilds with documented apprenticeship traditions, with extensive ecclesiastical records detailing costs, labourers, architects and construction phases. The Roman aqueducts were the product of a 200-year-old imperial engineering tradition backed by the largest professional military and civic apparatus the ancient world had ever produced. The pyramids, whatever their true origin, were the demonstrable focus of the entire organizational capacity of a centralized state. The cities of the 19th century have none of that. What they have instead is something more puzzling: world-spanning simultaneity. Consider what would have been required for the official story to be true. Dozens of cities on multiple continents would have had to independently develop within the same 50-year window, the same architecture.
I mean, just look how grand everything is, even those grand mirrors. I mean, just look at the size of them. Look at the size of those mirrors. Jeff UNP in the chat says, if you bring it like that, it almost seems like we are an experiment restarting on and on. But where are those watching then? So I could be wrong. Yeah, that's actually been a theory I've looked at as well. Some people actually think the watchers or the organizers of the experiment, either they died, moved on to other dimensions if they're interdimensional, and we're just left here. So somehow, whatever this experiment is, whatever this realm is, if that's the true theory, I'm not sure that's true. Again, I have no way of knowing, but if it's true, the resources or whatever energy required for all of this, for this realm to function and constantly restart, it was designed in a way where it perhaps would not need oversight. And we're kind of left to our own devices. But maybe every few millennia, the organizers or creators of the experiment come back. Or other entities come and check it out and possibly do stuff.
Textual vocabulary the same pilasters, the same cornices, the same dome proportions, the same decorative programs, without a common educational institution, without a common professional organisation, without a common government mandate, and without modern communication technology capable of transmitting detailed technical specifications across oceans in real time. The evidence suggests something much larger was at work. Not inspiration, not coincidence, coordination. And coordination at that scale requires an organising intelligence. It requires people who know each other, who share information, who have agreed explicitly or implicitly on a common framework. It requires, in short, a network. The 13 families, or however many there were, and I choose 13 as a round number that appears across multiple independent research traditions, not as a definitive count. These families were that network. Not because I can prove it, but because if you remove them from the equation, you are left with a historical impossibility. The spontaneous, simultaneous, coordinated emergence on a world-spanning scale of an identical high civilization, ex nihilo, with no paper trail. Choose your impossibility carefully. There is a category of historical event that researchers call a rupture. A moment when the normal accumulation of documents, the continuous paper trail of administration and commerce, and personal correspondence that makes historical reconstruction possible simply stops, and then, after a gap of variable length, starts again. But differently, with different names in charge, with different institutional frameworks in place, with different assumptions about what the recent past contained. The 1800s are full of ruptures. The historical record for most major American cities effectively begins somewhere between 1820 and 1870. Before that, there is something, fragments, claims, contested accounts, and then there is a gap, and then there is a fully formed city with fully formed institutions and a fully formed story about how it got there. The official explanation acknowledges the gap and calls it frontier conditions. Documentation was sparse, record keeping was informal, fires destroyed archives. All of that is true. Fires did destroy archives. But it is worth asking which archives, and who benefited from their destruction. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, the burning of Washington, D.C. in 1814, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria centuries earlier. We treat each of these as isolated disasters. What if they were part of a pattern? Not of deliberate arson necessarily, I am not making that claim, but of a systematic, possibly structural vulnerability in the places where the prior world's documentation was concentrated. What if the most important fires in history all burned the same category of thing? The deeper I went into this question, the more I noticed what was conspicuously absent from every surviving archive. Evidence of transition. Not the destination. We have plenty of documents describing the world as it was after the great reorganization of the 1800s. Not the origin. We have in scattered form tantalizing fragments of what the prior world may have looked like, but the process of getting from one to the other. The mechanism of transfer, that mechanism is missing. Not incomplete, not poorly documented, missing, and in its place, in archive after archive, city after city, country after country, we find the same thing. A formal document of acquisition, signed by representatives of a small number of family dynasties, establishing legal title to assets whose prior ownership is described in terms so vague as to be meaningless. Unclaimed land, abandoned property, territories without recognized sovereign. Someone built those territories, someone lived in those buildings, someone designed those drains and those aqueducts and those precisely oriented plazas, and then, officially, they were gone, and the families moved in. I want to end somewhere different from where most investigations like this one end. Most of them end in anger, in accusation, in the naming of villains and the allocation of blame. That's not where I am. Because the more I sat with this material, the buildings without builders, the cities without founders, the archives without the documents that should have been there, the more I found myself arriving at a question that isn't about power at all. It's about knowledge. Because here is what the 13 families, whatever we call them, however many there were, here is what they may have inherited, along with the land and the buildings and the legal frameworks. They may have inherited understanding, specific, technical, material understanding of how the prior world worked, how the buildings were built, what the infrastructure was actually designed to do, how the systems, economic, architectural, agricultural, medical, how the systems fit together, and what did they do with it? That is the question I cannot answer. And I've tried. Did they preserve it? Is there, somewhere in a private archive, in a family vault, in a library that is not listed in any public catalogue, a body of knowledge that would rewrite everything we think we know about the history of civilization? Is that knowledge still intact? Is it being used? Is it being slowly and selectively reintroduced into the public domain through academic institutions and technological breakthroughs attributed to discovery rather than recovery? Or did they lose it? That possibility is darker in some ways. That the families scrambling to consolidate their holdings in the chaotic aftermath of whatever event or process emptied the old world cities may have grabbed the physical assets without fully grasping the intellectual ones. That the knowledge of how to replicate what they inherited may have been more fragile than the stone and iron they were inheriting. That the prior civilization, whatever it was, encoded its knowledge in forms the inheritors could not read. That we are living right now in a world built on foundations we don't fully understand, inside systems whose original purpose we have forgotten, and that the families themselves, the supposed masterminds, the supposed controllers of the hidden architecture of history, may simply be the curators of a museum they cannot explain.
So again, I don't necessarily agree here. I think there's far more Illuminati bloodlines going back way further back. This is kind of a more innocent, more of a coincidence theorist explanation, claiming that these bloodlines don't know. Although, again, we don't really know. The motto here, of course, is the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. But this is kind of like just a superficial level explanation of Tartaria, reset, inheritors, etc. I don't think it's... I think there's way more to this. This doesn't even factor interdimensional reptilian shapeshifters. It doesn't factor in other entities in other realms that possibly were giving technology to the inhabitants of this realm. It doesn't factor in, again, just this overarching Illuminati, Freemason, secret societies that have passed on knowledge of all of that. So, yeah.
Of a museum they cannot explain. Rich beyond imagination. Powerful beyond precedent. And fundamentally irreducibly lost. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The grandeur of the buildings. The absence of the builders, the names in the founding documents, the fires that took the archives, the gap in the record where the transition should be, the worldwide simultaneity that coordination alone cannot explain, the knowledge that should be there and isn't, the silence.
And again, I think it is there. Like, what's in the Vatican archive that nobody can look at? Now, that could just be a distraction, right? Like, that would be the smart play, right? Like, they would have the real stuff somewhere else, just in case someone did break into the Vatican archive. But the point is, and same thing with reptilians, too. I mean, I know about all the history. Again, you could check out my David Icke deep dive into reptilians, but it almost seems it's a little too convenient. It seems like they threw that out there to distract people, right? And so the real truth could be something else. Not that there's not truth to the reptilians. Those could also be true. But they might not be the true string pullers. The true string pullers might have just thrown that out there, kind of like, a mafia organization, leaving someone out hanged to dry. Yeah, they're tangentially related criminal, maybe involved in some stuff, but they're not the true bosses.
Where the explanation should live. The evidence suggests something much larger than any single family, any single conspiracy, any single historical rupture. It suggests a world before our world, a civilization before our civilization, a story before the story we've been told, and it suggests that when that world ended, however it ended, for whatever reason it ended, 13 families, more or less, were standing closest to the door when everything went quiet. And they walked in. And they took what they could carry. And they have been living on that inheritance ever since. Whether they understand what they're holding, whether any of us will ever find out what it is, whether the door is still somewhere in some archive behind some acquisition record waiting to be opened again, I don't know. I don't think anyone does.
So, yeah, a lot of big questions here. A lot of really big questions. I got one more video here for the Coincidence Theorists and the Bootlickers on how history could have been rewritten. I think this might be from the same channel. I don't even have the name here, but fair use, obviously. Prepare to have your minds
in the year
shocked even
1930,
further here, because this might actually explain how this was all covered up in the first place.
In the year 1913, one of the wealthiest men who ever lived signed a series of quiet checks that would change the inside of every public library in the United States. His name was Andrew Carnegie.
Library? Sorry, couldn't resist.
By the time he was finished, he had funded the construction of more than 1,600 public libraries across America, and several thousand more around the world. The official story is that he was a philanthropist. The official story is that he loved knowledge, loved reading, and wanted every small town in the country to have a place where ordinary people could borrow a book for free. That is the story you were taught in school. That is the story written on the bronze plaques outside the buildings. But if you look at what actually happened inside those buildings in the years after they opened, a much stranger pattern starts to surface. Because Carnegie did not just build the libraries, he also paid for what went on the shelves. He paid for the cataloguing systems, the librarian training, and the new printed editions of the books themselves. And in that same window of years, between roughly 1908 and 1920, a quiet, countrywide purge of older books began. Books printed before the Civil War, books printed before 1800, volumes that had sat in town libraries, church libraries, and private collections for generations. They were declared outdated, declared damaged, declared unfit, and they were removed. Some were burned. Some were pulped. Some were sent to warehouses and never seen again. And in their place, on the new oak shelves of the new Carnegie buildings, fresh editions appeared, newly printed, newly edited, newly approved. This is the story of what was on those old shelves before the new books arrived, and why a single man in a single decade may have rewritten the memory of an entire country. Before we go any deeper, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We tell long, careful documentary stories on subjects the standard history books either skip or smooth over.
So again, for all the coincidence theorist bootlickers who say you can't rewrite history, I mean, just look at how things are reported in different countries. Even today, in real time, with cell phones, you could look at the COVID narratives, etc. To hallucinate that this couldn't have been done, I mean, that's a special kind of goofery.
If you find this kind of story interesting, that small tap genuinely helps us keep digging. To understand what happened in 1913, you have to understand who Andrew Carnegie actually was. He came to America from Scotland as a poor boy, worked in a textile mill, then a telegraph office, then the railroads. By the 1870s, he had moved into steel, and by the 1890s, he controlled the largest steel operation in the world. When he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901, the sale created United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Carnegie personally walked away with the modern equivalent of more than $10 billion in cash. He was, for a brief period, the richest private individual on the planet. And then, very publicly, he announced that he was going to give it all away. He wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that a rich man who died rich had died disgraced. The centerpiece of that redistribution was libraries, thousands of them.
Let's go back to this one image here. Just look at how ludicrous this is here.
The first billion-dollar $1 billion in cash, $1 billion going to give it wealth, in which he argued that a thousands like going to $1 billion in cash. He was, for a brief period, the richest private individual on the planet.
So, I don't know if this image is AI or real, but it does represent real images where you have these shanties. These wooden shanties next to this ornate stone structures. Like, what kind of goof? What is the population of this little town here? Like 31? How did they build this? I mean, everybody knows how they built the shanties. But how did they build these giant ornate stone structures?
And then, very publicly, he announced that he was going to give it all away. He wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that a rich man who died rich had died disgraced. The centrepiece of that redistribution was libraries, thousands of them, free public brick and stone with his name carved over the door. On the surface, this sounds like one of the kindest acts in American history. But look at the timing. Between 1890 and 1915, the United States went through one of the strangest construction booms in its history. Cities that had been small frontier towns just 30 years earlier.
These actually might be all real photos. I recognize a bunch of them that I've been looking, I've seen them like 10 years ago before AI, but yeah, I don't know if all of them, I didn't recognize that one particular one, but yeah, I don't know.
Suddenly grew enormous central buildings, courthouses with vaulted marble ceilings, state capitals with cast iron domes, train stations with arched glass roofs spanning entire city blocks. World's fairs were built and then almost entirely demolished within a single summer. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, called the White City, contained around 200 buildings in a neoclassical style, full of statuary, fountains, columns and electric lighting. The official story is that it was constructed in about 2 years out of a temporary material called staff, a mix of plaster and jute fibre, and then torn down. An entire white marble-looking city, gone in months. And in the years immediately after these fairs, the libraries arrived, Carnegie Libraries. Quiet, dignified neoclassical buildings in the exact same architectural language as the fair pavilions and the courthouses. They appeared in town after town, often replacing older wooden buildings that had served as the previous library or reading room. The old buildings were demolished, the old contents were removed, and the new building, with the new contents, took their place. Now here is where the official record starts to develop strange gaps. If you go looking for the catalogues of pre-Carnegie Town libraries in the United States, you will find that for a surprising number of towns, those catalogues simply do not exist anymore. The handwritten ledger books, the index cards, the donation records, the lists of which families gave which volumes are missing. In the towns where they do survive, they list books that do not appear in the new Carnegie libraries that replace them. Books on subjects that quietly stopped being taught. Books on geography that described continents and coastlines slightly differently than the modern maps. Books on architecture that explained how to build domes, arches and stone vaults using techniques the modern construction industry claims required steel reinforcement to achieve. Books on what was called natural philosophy, the old word for science, that described phenomena involving atmospheric electricity, resonance and ether in ways that were quietly dropped from the curriculum within a single generation. And books, repeatedly, on the history of a place that almost no modern textbook will name. A vast continental empire mentioned in older atlases and older encyclopedias that stretched across the northern half of the world, Tartaria. By the time the Carnegie Libraries had finished their work, that name was almost completely gone from the shelves. You can verify part of this yourself. If you pull up a digitized copy of the Encyclopaedia Britannica from the late 1700s or the early 1800s, the entry for Tartary, sometimes spelled Tartaria, is long and detailed. It describes a region stretching from the Volga River across all of Siberia, down through Central Asia, into parts of what is now northern China. Older maps, published in Amsterdam, London and Paris, show this region marked clearly, sometimes labelled Grand Tartary, sometimes Independent Tartary, sometimes Chinese Tartary. By the late 1800s, the entry begins to shrink. By the early 1900s, it is almost gone. By the time the new Carnegie editions of standard reference books are sitting on the new Carnegie shelves, Tartary has been replaced by a patchwork of Russian provinces, Mongolian regions and Chinese frontiers with no shared identity and no shared history. An entire civilization, the size of a continent, edited out of the reference section in about 3 decades. and the institutions that finished the edit were, in many small American towns, the Carnegie Libraries. There is another detail worth sitting with. Carnegie did not simply hand over money and let towns build whatever they wanted. The grants came with conditions. A town that accepted a Carnegie Library grant had to agree to provide the land, fund the ongoing operation through local taxation, and follow the architectural and operational guidelines that Carnegie's office issued. Those guidelines specified the layout of the rooms, they specified the staffing, they specified the use of the new Dewey Decimal Classification System, which had been published in 1876 and was rapidly becoming standard. And the classification system itself quietly determined which subjects existed and which did not.
Also, let's just do a super quick aside. Let's go to the etymology here. Carnegie. Is that similar to carnage? Carnegie, carnage. Great destruction by bloody violence, massacre. Carnagio, from Old Italian, slaughter, murder. From medieval Latin, carnaticum, flesh. From Latin, carnaticum, slaughter of animals. From carnem, nominative caro, flesh or piece of flesh. In English, it has always been used more often of the slaughter of men. So it's interesting that this guy named Carnegie, Carnage, all the same word. The slaughter of men through losing knowledge, the slaughter of knowledge.
A subject that had no Dewey number did not get a shelf. A book that did not fit a Dewey number became difficult to catalogue, and a book that was difficult to catalogue was easy to declare surplus. The system, by its very structure, defined the shape of acceptable knowledge. It is also worth looking at what the Carnegie Libraries themselves looked like. If you walk into one of the surviving original buildings today, the masonry is heavier than anything modern. The ceilings are higher, the cornices are deeper, the stonework around the windows is carved with detail that no modern budget would allow. Many of them have copper roofs, leaded glass, marble staircases, and ornamental ironwork that would cost a fortune to reproduce now. Researchers who look closely at the budgets of these projects often find that the official construction costs, adjusted for inflation, are far too low for what was actually built. A small town Carnegie Library that cost, on paper, $12,000 in 1908 would, by any honest modern estimate, cost 10 to 50 times that to recreate from scratch today. And yet, town after town, they went up in months. The standard explanation is cheap immigrant labour and abundant raw materials. The standard explanation does not quite cover the carved limestone friezes. Some researchers, working outside the academic mainstream, have proposed something else. They suggest that many of the Carnegie Libraries were not, in fact, built in the years they are officially dated. They suggest that the buildings were already there, that they were older structures, part of the same architectural civilization that produced the World's Fairs, the courthouses, and the central train stations. That Carnegie's money did not pay for their construction, it paid for their reassignment. The buildings were renamed, new cornerstones were laid, new dedication plaques were carved, and the public was told that a wealthy steel magnate had given them this beautiful new building, when in fact the building had already stood on that ground for longer than anyone alive could remember. There is no signed document confessing to it. There is only the pattern of cost, the pattern of style, the pattern of timing, and the pattern of what disappeared from the shelves at exactly the moment the doors opened, because that is the part that is hardest to look away from. The books, wherever the buildings actually came from, the contents of those buildings were rewritten in a single generation. School board minutes from small towns in Ohio, Iowa, and upstate New York, from the years between 1908 and 1922, occasionally surface in local archives. They describe routine library committee meetings in which members vote to discard older volumes as obsolete. They list bonfires of damaged books in the backlots behind the libraries. They list shipments of older volumes to paper mills for pulping, often by the wagon load. One surviving committee record from a small town in Pennsylvania from 1914 mentions, almost in passing, the disposal of more than 4,000 volumes from the previous town reading room in order to make room for the new collection donated through the Carnegie program. 4,000 volumes from one small town, multiplied across more than 1,600 towns. The total, if even roughly accurate, is in the millions. And the approved manuscripts mattered, because in those same years the discipline of academic history in the United States was being rebuilt from the ground up. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, established by Andrew Carnegie in 1905, was one of the largest sources of funding for that standardization. It paid for textbook commissions, it paid for teacher training, it paid for the printing of new editions of basic school readers, basic histories, basic geographies. And those new editions were the ones that ended up on the new Carnegie Library shelves. The man who provided the buildings also provided the books, also provided the system for arranging the books, also provided the training for the people who handed the books to the public. At every layer of the chain, the same name appears. Carnegie, Carnegie, Carnegie. None of this proves a deliberate erasure on its own. A wealthy man funding many connected projects is not, by itself, a conspiracy. But step back from the individual pieces and look at the shape of the result. Within roughly 20 years, between about 1900 and 1920, the American public lost casual access to the pre-1850 book. The old volumes that had sat in small private collections in church basements, in family parlours, and in volunteer reading rooms were swept into a single national clearance. The buildings that replaced those reading rooms were larger, grander, and more impressive than any small town could have built on its own. The books that filled those buildings were newly printed, newly approved, and newly consistent with each other. And the story those books told about America, about the world, about the continents and their histories, was the story we still read today. Anything that did not fit that story had, by the 1920s, become almost impossible for an ordinary citizen to find without travelling to a major research university. So when you stand in front of an old Carnegie Library today, in some quiet town with a creek running behind it and a flag out front, look at the building for a moment longer than you normally would. Look at the heaviness of the stone. Look at the carving above the door. Ask yourself how a single steel magnate in a single career paid for so many of these in so many places in so few years. And then, when you walk inside, look at the shelves. Look at the publication dates on the spines. Notice how few of them go back before about 1890. Notice how clean and continuous the record looks. Notice the absence of the older voices, the older maps, the older names. Notice that the building feels older than the books it contains. That gap between the age of the walls and the age of the pages is the gap this story lives inside. And whatever you choose to believe about who built the walls, the pages, at least, were changed in a deliberate and traceable way by a small group of people in a small number of years with a very large amount of money. That part is not a theory. That part is in the public record. The rest is for you to sit with, quietly, the next time you pass under one of those carved stone arches and feel, just for a moment, that you are walking into a building that knows something it is not telling you.
There you have it. So again, the retard Maxer's hallucinating. History could not have been rewritten. It pretty obviously has been. Now, what the true story is, of course, we don't know. We don't know. Scott Hawkins says, we live in a time of deception and inversion. That much is true. Jeff U1P says, building look like a mausoleum. That is also true. That is also true. Putting to death the real history? That would be quite an inside joke for the goofs. For the string pullers laughing at the goofs who hallucinate in their Stockholm Syndrome stupor. They hallucinate. It would be impossible to change history in any way. Well, you know what's kind of curious is mausoleum itself, stately burial place. Is that where the truth is buried? The library? I mean, just a lot of the etymology here. I mean, does it all fall into the revelation of the method theory where they must disclose the truth to try to trick the people into consent to not violate free will, if those are the rules of the universe? So, yeah, there you have it. Plenty more to go in examining history and whether or not it was rewritten. I will be doing the True History of the World follow-up, so I have 2 episodes so far. We're going to go Pompeii, a curious story that doesn't seem to match. I mean, once you start looking at almost anything, right? Almost anything doesn't match. Like, it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. Yeah, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. If you find the MindShock podcast interesting and informative, you could donate to our PayPal. Check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.